All right, we move on to our next speaker, who is Delia Catacutan, who is a principal scientist and acting country representative Philippines at World Agroforestry, also known as ICRAF. Delia, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So let me just share my screen. Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so again, thank you very much for having me in this SIANI annual meeting. I remember I participated in the 2019, I believe, SIANI meeting in Bangkok, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a pleasure to be back to the SIANI meetings, and I hope I'm able to share something worthwhile today. So the topic that was requested for me to present was about food systems, with a particular focus on agroforestry in Southeast Asia, and from there drawing insights for research. So just a little bit of structure. I would begin by providing some snippets of the status of agriculture in Southeast Asia, and then as well as the state and the challenges for food systems in Asia. And that will be followed with some slides on agroforestry as a nature-based solution to sustainable food systems. And then I will focus on the research part and what needs to be done in terms of research. Okay. So here we go. For the status of agriculture and trade in Asia, as we know that agriculture contributes 10.6% of the ASEAN gross domestic production in 2018, but significant population remains dependent on agriculture despite shifts to manufacturing and other services. Labor productivity in ASEAN from agriculture was stagnant for 4 countries that are most dependent on agriculture. These are Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and Vietnam, despite the fact that agriculture accounts to 15 to 20% of this country's GDP and 34 to 60% of the total employment in these countries in 2018. Agri-food commodities provided, in fact, economic stability at the regional level, at the ASEAN level, but there is big differences in net trade balances. So especially for countries like Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, and the Philippines, who have consistently provided negative balances in agri-food trade in 2015-2019, as you can see in the graph here. Of course, Singapore is also there because Singapore is basically not an agriculture country. Overall, the region is reliant on and very vulnerable to complex international food supply chains, and particularly on the input side. The ASEAN countries are heavily dependent on very expensive inputs coming from countries outside of the ASEAN region. So that makes the food systems and food production very, very challenging. Also in ASEAN, there's an observed reduction in arable land from 0.22 to 0.12 hectares per person between 1961 and 2016, as reported by World Bank in 2020. This loss occurred at a mean annual decline of arable land at the rate of 1.18%. So it's quite a high rate of reduction in arable lands. And this is primarily due to conversion of agricultural lands into built-up areas and urbanization. The annual cost of land degradation in ASEAN region is about 5.97 billion or 2.5% of the regional GDP of the country. So there is a big disparity in terms of the cost to land rehabilitation as opposed to the agricultural contribution to the region's GDP. Now, when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic, it has basically laid bare the fragility of the existing ASEAN food system, which often depends on costly imported inputs, as I mentioned earlier. Now, However, food systems in Southeast Asia has been transforming, and it is still continuing to do so. So from cropping system, we're now into farming systems, and we're hoping this will still transform over time. Also from smallholder to commercial production, from traditional to modern retail markets, and from production-centric to market-driven food systems. But there are also many challenges regarding food systems in the ASEAN region. One is persistence of extreme poverty in the region. More than 320 million people are living in extreme poverty. Half of the population cannot afford food that meets basic nutritional requirements. And also there's the yearly natural disasters that the region experiences: typhoon, earthquakes, flooding. It's so susceptible to extreme events. With regards to the pandemic, it has greatly disrupted domestic production and distribution, which resulted in deficits in staples such as rice, eggs, and sugar. It also affected labor availability, particularly, for example, in Thailand, where majority or many of the agricultural laborers are actually migrant workers from neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos. So during the pandemic, when these migrant workers have to move back to their countries, Thailand actually experienced labor scarcity in the agricultural sector. So overall, the pandemic has impacted the livelihoods of more than 600 million people in the ASEAN region. As a result of that, there's, of course, a soaring increase in food prices due to supply chain disruptions and rising shipping costs. Many of the countries in, the ASEAN region is comprised of both archipelagic countries as well as continental countries. So that resulted in food insecurity, which again had ripple effects. For example, food insecurity has led to food nationalism, for example, in Vietnam. So when there was, during this, the pandemic, and even prior to that, Vietnam reviewed its rice exports, and realizing that it has gone down, then it hoarded their rice production. It stopped their exports to other ASEAN countries, resulting in a serious deficit in rice supply for those dependent from Vietnam for rice. There's also a challenge about natural resource distribution, particularly on water. So, and which created some kind of food-related diplomatic relations and security issues in the region. An example is in the Mekong region, more than 12 billion cubic meter of water have been already withheld by upstream dams. So Cambodia very soon will be seriously in trouble when it comes to agricultural production with low supply of water from upstream sources. So social and environmental changes may thwart sustainable food systems as a regional priority of ASEAN. It is, in fact, a regional priority, but complex social and environmental challenges may be difficult for the ASEAN region to address. Really, what we are seeing here is that the resilience of the ASEAN agri-food systems lies in quickly addressing issues around land degradation, climate change, population and poverty, the outbreaks of pests and diseases, as well as trade and connectivity issues. So here's the food systems ecosystem in the region. And of course, this is really nothing new. I think this is applicable anywhere and everywhere, and you can put so many circles around the food system, so the input supply, the policies in terms of production, distribution, and trade, availability of information, new technologies, extension, the infrastructure and mobility. Mobility has greatly affected the export and import dynamics in the ASEAN region during the pandemic. Market, of course, promotion and consumer culture, producer knowledge and producer culture, the natural capital itself, and capitalization. All of this come together, interplaying, interacting with each other around food systems, supply, and distribution. So now our proposition is that agroforestry is a nature-based solution to our food systems challenge. The UN Food System Summit was already mentioned by the first speaker, and I would like to elaborate and to cite an example to highlight that action track 3 of the summit is about boosting nature-positive production. And it says that to achieve nature-positive production systems, we must adopt practices that protect, manage, and restore nature while globally meeting the fundamental rights to healthy and nutritious food for all. There are so many qualities of agroforestry that meets what it is to be a solution. That agroforestry provides comparable yields and higher outputs while supporting biodiversity and enhancing ecological functions. It improves land use efficiency by generating multiple goods and services from a single unit of land. Through on-farm diversification, agroforestry carries fewer economic risks. And there are examples from the Philippines as well as in Vietnam to that. There's so many evidence in the literature that suggests the ecological and economic benefits agroforestry bring into livelihoods as well as to the food systems. Now, there are a number of opportunities for agroforestry to foster sustainability in food systems. The first is in ASEAN. The spike in food prices and trade imbalance in agri-food products, particularly during the pandemic, indicates the importance of diversified food production systems to nourish the ASEAN population. The role of agroforestry in responsible investment is also highlighted in the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework for COVID-19. There is greater increasing demand for sustainable agri-food forestry products and deforestation-free supply chains. Another one is healthy lifestyles. In a recent study by Facebook and Bain & Company, it was found that 73% of Southeast Asian consumers reported being more health conscious and 54% more environmentally conscious in the new normal of COVID-19. Consumers in the Philippines and Vietnam, for example, prioritize health and wellness even more than value for money. So we also said that certified agroforestry products can increase the market power of farmers. It also contributes to corporate social responsibility and boosts the confidence of consumers in safe production practices. Now we look into donor spending of agroforestry in ASEAN. So there are opportunities for agroforestry as a nature-based solution for food systems in ASEAN. And now we look into this donor spending. So how are our donors, international donors, spending their money? Just a second. Okay. So as you can see here, there's 5 trillion budget US dollars, no, for budget of official donors to development aid. 2.79 billion went to 323 agroforestry inclusive projects and 130.59 million to 138 agroforestry specific projects. During this period, AMS received, this is in, I think, for the period of 2010 to 2019. During that period, AMS received 9.28% and 4.26% of the global total for agroforestry inclusive and agroforestry specific projects, respectively. Now, in terms of the SDGs, international donors invested 143.3 million in agroforestry projects in low and middle income countries. Excluding Brunei, Darussalam, and Singapore, AMS captured 27.48 million or 19.17% of total global donor spending in agroforestry projects. 5 of the 17 goals, SDG goals, were covered by these projects in ASEAN. And These projects, among the agroforestry projects that are included in the database, the largest aid recipient for agroforestry was Vietnam, followed by Indonesia and the Philippines. And you will note that the bulk of agroforestry projects through official development assistance focused on alleviating hunger and improving life on land, which is essentially the core of sustainable food systems. Now, what about agroforestry in research in ASEAN? So is funding for development, aid funding for agroforestry development projects matching the status of agroforestry research in ASEAN? So let's see. The global trend in agroforestry research shows the progression from plot level through to landscape scale analysis of development and conservation issues. So ICRAF colleagues conducted a bibliometric analysis of agroforestry in Southeast Asia using the ICRAF database and Google Scholar. And we found that there are 266 peer-reviewed publications over the last 4 decades. 1980 to 2020. Most of these publications contained or were coming from Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. So agroforestry publications were scarce in countries like Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste, and there's nothing recorded for Brunei. Now, in terms of publications by research topic, we found that in 1984 to 200, there's a lot of topics published around on agroforestry in terms of soil conservation. There was a change from 2020 to agro-biodiversity being the topmost topic considered in agroforestry. And then in the last decade, 2011 and 2020, now agroforestry research highlights or focuses on livelihoods and food security, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and agroforestry models and species. And you can see also a global bibliometric analysis of agroforestry research conducted by Liu in 2019 suggested that livelihoods and food security have been the focus of agroforestry research in Southeast Asia to address the challenge of rapid population growth. So that is quite encouraging in terms of food systems research. You see, theoretically speaking, agroforestry research has indeed contributed to food systems research in ASEAN. Now, if we look at food systems research, then despite the contribution of agroforestry to food systems research, there are still problems and needs that needs to be addressed. So then I would like to take you back into these 2 models of food systems research and food systems research and development. So the first model is a linear model, wherein the food system is seen as a linear representation of linkages between food supply and demand activities. The second model is more circular, where food systems are considered circular systems that takes account waste recovery and nutrient cycle. Of course, this is inspired by the circular economy thinking. Now, the problem, though, remains that agricultural research has remained compartmentalized and single commodity focused rather than food systems orientated. So if you can see here, so we do research in, for example, coffee, sugar, and even rice as single commodities rather than in relation to other commodities on land in a given landscape. We also tend to do research first either in the input side, looking at the productivity of farming systems. Then another research, we look into processing, another research on marketing, on retail and consumption, and so on and so forth. But there is little research, or even rarely research is conducted in a very holistic manner that accounts from the input side, all through this, the food supply system and the circular food system. So why is it that happening? Most of the problems we encounter in research is that agricultural research is less funded. So there is, and often they are time bounded, so limited in time. So there is very limited opportunity to conduct comprehensive long-term food systems research. So food systems research in that case then needs to transform. Now, in the case of agroforestry, research has to broaden. Although agroforestry research has broadened the understanding of land use sustainability, more emphasis should be placed on bridging thematic and geographic disparities in outputs. As you can see in the previous slides, there's a disparity in terms of production of, of publications, no? Publication as research outputs between countries in ASEAN. There should be, we suggested a focus on policies, gender, value chain and markets, and ecosystem services, but not on a piecemeal basis. All of this taken all together in a research, in an agroforestry research design. Now, generally for food systems research should employ integrative approaches to look at these topics all together as far as possible in terms of, for example, diversification. So how can cropping be as diverse as possible to meet short, medium, long-term goals and thus become resilient and progressive? Then to move beyond that, to look at landscape level interactions of those cropping systems. So how do diverse cropping or farming systems interact or are linked at landscape level, both on aspects of production and ecological functioning? For example, how does rice production interact with other farming systems in a given landscape? Third is to look at production output linkages. What cropping or farming systems contribute both to production and household or livelihoods resilience? In some cases, a farming system is resilient, but doesn't directly result in livelihoods resilience. What is its place, for example, and contribution all the way from local to national, regional economies? And last but not the least, to look at governance issues, structural and policy adjustments to balance regional agri-food trade while also keeping national food sovereignty. As I said earlier, ideally, in order to move fast and to make food systems research responsive to the transitioning food systems situation in ASEAN, research has to transform in the manner that it adapt integrative approaches, such as looking into different aspects as different dimensions of food systems. Now, what we really need to do from the research side is to develop an integrated food systems research that is well informed by proper baseline information and inputs from stakeholders along the food systems chain. Create multidisciplinary teams to undertake comprehensive food systems research nationally and regionally. Seek long-term research investments and funding. And this is, I think, the most difficult part of it, because as I mentioned earlier, research funding in agriculture has always been at the low compared to other topics. Finally, engage ASEAN leaders in policy dialogues and action research via their partner institutions. And I think I will end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Delia, for that elaborate presentation. Remember, you can post your questions and reflections on the chat. If you have any specific questions from the two previous speakers, you can just tag them in the chat right there on your screen. Thank you so much, Delia.